how do we get those primitive nervous systems, those first neurons that are electrically excitable, the first sensory systems? What do we know about how those things come into the picture?
Well, I'm that's not what I really work on, but I do have some thoughts. I mean, the first thing I would say is that a neuron is not so very different to other types of cell. Now, the first thing to say is we're talking about eukaryotic cells here. We're talking about animals with nervous systems and neurons in nervous systems. And what they're doing, in my mind, this is a gross simplification, but what they're doing is passing signals on by depolarizing. They're excitable. They have a charge across their plasma membrane, and that can depolarize and pass on a signal saying something or other. Now, all cells have a charge across their plasma membrane, and so all cells are neuron-like in that way. And bacterial cells are as well in the same way. So all cells have got a charge across the membrane. And what's then interesting and slightly different about neurons is they will dynamically change the charge. They will depolarize, do something, repolarize, and do that repeatedly. And they kind of their life is continually depolarizing and repolarizing again. Whereas for most cells, they're just polarized and they stay that way. And if they depolarize, they'll get ejected, they'll die, they'll be, but the amount of invention that's required to go from a cell with a charge on the membrane to a cell with a charge on the membrane, which is capable of deflating and then reflating, it is not such a long way to go in terms of evolutionary distance. And in terms of how, let's say, bacteria work, I mean, one of the more beautiful examples that I'm familiar with is if a bacterium is attacked by viruses, what we call bacteriophages, one of two things can happen, I suppose. Either they're going to get taken out by the virus, or if it's kind of inevitable that the virus is going to come in, either the virus is going to make copies of itself, exploit that bacterial cell, and then invade the next bacterial cell and so on. Or the bacterial cell can prevent that from happening by killing itself, by a form of controlled cell death. Now, how does it do that? Well, it does that by depolarizing its membrane, as terminal depolarization of the membrane. So if it gets invaded by viruses, it depolarizes itself and kills itself before the virus has a chance to replicate itself and infect the next cell. And this is quite well known. This happens a lot, especially in marine blooms of cyanobacteria, say, these kind of things. All kinds of algal blooms will do the same thing. And it's quite easy to show in terms of known evolutionary processes like kin selection that it is to the advantage of this bacterial cell to kill itself so that the closely related genes in the neighboring bacteria, the related bacteria, are going to do better.
Right.
So in terms of the selfish gene kind of ideas, all of that makes perfect sense. What's interesting to me, though, is it's about the depolarization of the cell as an entity. And there's all kinds of, these are things that I've kind of worried about. How does a cell know how it's doing? How does it know that it was just invaded by a virus? How does it distinguish between that and being a little bit too hot or a bit too cold or not having enough oxygen or having a toxin there? How does a cell which doesn't have a nervous system, doesn't have any eyes or nose or anything, somehow it's got to understand enough about the environment. Things happen in the environment. That perturbs its metabolism because there's nothing else in there beyond metabolism. And gene expression in that sense is a response to perturbation of metabolism. How does it know what it should do? And there may be multiple conflicting things, and you can imagine a lot of this is going to be positive feedback loops or negative feedback loops, or it's just automated, you might say. But you can have conflict between these different systems. How do you make a decision as to which one you're going to do? I think that the membrane potential itself, which is effectively generated by metabolism and powers metabolism in this odd closed loop, is going to tell you a lot about how you're doing in relation to the environment as a bacterial cell.
Right.
And now you incorporate this bacterial cell inside an archaeon, and it eventually becomes a eukaryotic cell with mitochondria. And the control of cell death is still controlled by the mitochondria, which will depolarize if things are going wrong and kill the whole entity. And then you have a multicellular organism, and the pathways of development are a lot about the electrical potential across the plasma membrane. You can have voltage maps across the development of small organisms, things like planaria, some of Mike Levin's work, for example.
Yes. I was about to
The
bring him
head
up.
or the tail and so on are effectively defined by the voltage across networks of cells that share a common voltage connected by gap junctions. So all of this is kind of electrical. It's all working on an electrical basis, and inside it all, we've got the mitochondria, which have got their own voltage and which are somehow talking to all the rest of this network in ways that we don't really know how that works. And we still see apoptosis, these forms of controlled cell death, which still depend on the membrane potential. And an outcome of all of this, how do you know how you're doing in relation to the environment? A lot depends on the electrical charges. They will be modulated according to exactly how metabolism is doing in relation to the environment. As you get more sophisticated, you end up with a subpopulation of cells that become neurons, which are doing this actively. They're effectively sampling from the rest of the body and firing by exactly the same processes of depolarization of the membrane potential to instruct your behavior in relation to the environment. So, it's a very broad brushstroke picture, but neurons in that context are doing the same things that bacterial cells always did, using the same machinery, just in a more sophisticated way.
Right. Very cool. Very, very well explained. I get the sense that you think electricity and bioelectricity might be the key to some of biology's largest mysteries at the moment. And it's been relatively unexplored, and there's not been enough research done in those areas. Would that be correct to say?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's an area which I think a lot of people see as crank science, to be honest. And there've been, people like Mike Levin have been doing really good work. Still, there's a fair amount of suspicion from let's say, more mainstream scientists about it. But every time there's the very name molecular biology effectively has the answer in its title. It says everything's about molecules and chemistry.
Right.
Now, if you take a step back and you think, how do we know how mitochondria work? Well, it goes back to Peter Mitchell and Jennifer Moyle back in the 1960s, showing that it's part of a bigger system. It's not a property of this molecule or that molecule or any one protein. It requires the system. It requires the membrane. It requires the pumps in the membrane. It requires orientation. It requires spatial direction. You're pumping in a certain direction. They're coming back in a different direction. So the way that respiration works is a property of a larger system, and you end up with an electrical charge across that membrane. And that membrane in a bacterial cell is the bounding membrane between the inside of the cell and the outside world. And in a mitochondria, in some sense, it still is. Even though it's buried inside a cell, we're delivering all this oxygen and all this food and electrons straight to this place. If there's anything that changes in the environment, you put a plastic bag over your head. The place where it's felt first is in your mitochondria, which now don't have enough oxygen. So you can't respire anymore. You're not passing electrons on anymore, and metabolism doesn't work properly anymore. So the place where you feel that plastic bag first, if you like, is in your mitochondria.
Right.
So that is still, even though it seems to be buried inside us, it's still the interface with the outside world. So all of this is electrical, is part of a bigger system. So the idea then that this bigger system also applies to networks of cells, and that how they are kind of predetermined that this is going to become the head and this is going to become the tail. The idea that electrical charge is part of that, I find very appealing. A lot of people it's not the right explanatory paradigm for them, because they think in terms of the nuts and bolts of proteins rather than the system. And again, when you get up to whole central nervous systems, when you're thinking about voltage maps anyway as defining how the entity is working as an agent in the world, as an individual, then the central nervous system or nervous system is kind of built up on this platform of electrical charges and changes in charges as being the language that's explaining how you're doing in relation to the world. Um, there's all kinds of things that is partly voltage. There's potentially other kinds of field involved in there, and lots of people get very worried as soon as anybody uses the word electromagnetic field in biology. Most molecular biologists will start backing away.
Right.
And in some sense, they may be right, because there is a lot of kind of, I wouldn't like to say pseudoscience, but a lot of science is difficult to judge whether it was good science or not.
Yes.
And so there's also a lot of vested interest that if it turns out that all kinds of electrical devices do in fact influence our physiology in some way, well, do we want to know? Probably we should know. Do people want us to know? I mean, you can very easily end up in a kind of conspiracy theory land.
Yes.
So it's a place that most people are very cautious about going anywhere near. I think, from my own point of view, the idea that charge and fields and voltage maps and ways of understanding how you're doing in relation to the world, how can metabolism, which is even in a bacterial cell, 1 billion reactions every second, second after second, how does all that mess, all of that chemistry, how do you kind of integrate it and come up with an answer like that just says, okay, I'm doing bad, go?
Yes.
I think that's what the chargers are doing. That's what it is integrating the system as a whole and giving you a snapshot, kind of finger to the wind answer as to how you're doing.
That's so phenomenal.
The Giant Shoulder mission is to explore radical ideas in biology, neuroscience, and consciousness, and elevate those stories to the highest possible level while keeping them accessible to everyone. If this interests you and you want to support independent science, then please consider subscribing to the Clips channel. Check out our 26 Neuroscience book. You can download it for free